Sometimes you have to solo on a single chord for a longer time, and it can be hard to keep things interesting, so having the option of using some outside material to change things up can make your solo a lot better, if you can get it to sound right. The point of using outside material is to make it sound wrong. Because you want the listener to feel the tension that needs to resolve, and that helps make the solo more interesting and gives it a story. Playing notes that don't fit the chord is pretty easy. But playing something that moves away and comes back so that it still sounds like music is much more difficult. But as you'll see, it's far from impossible, and there are quite a few ways that you can do so. The first approach is to move up a half step from the chord that you're soloing over. For this video, I'm using a static G7 chord. In fact, it's a really nice backing track from Quist, and there's a link in the description if you want to try it out. And if you move up a half step from G7, then you of course have an A-flat-7 chord. And almost all the notes in that scale will sound outside. And in fact, the A-flat-7 works as a tritone substitute for the dominant of G7, D7. So there's also sort of a harmonic connection, but that's not really what I'm using in the solo. Instead, I'm moving from the normal solo into the outside material by repeating a phrase or a part of a phrase and giving the listener something to hold on to when things start to get weird. Here's that section. And then that short phrase is shifted up, and I can keep on improvising using A-flat-7 material. Another thing that you should notice is how I'm playing long notes that really drive home the tension they create before resolving with a short phrase that moves back into the G7 chord. The next one is also using another chord as a way of thinking about the outside solo, but then we get into using some exotic scales as a different approach and rely more on structures like triads. Another option for side-slipping or sidestepping is to move down a half step, so in this case down to F#7, which sometimes is a bit nicer because it sounds less like a dominant and therefore a little bit more mysterious. This solo also uses the motivic technique of getting to the outside section, but here the motif is also placed differently in the rhythm as well. It's about giving the listener the idea that they get the melody, but then because it's shifted away, they are at the same time surprised about how it sounds. And the same type of motivic development is used with a basic F-sharp triad melody to go back to G7. A later example will also use voice leading as a way of resolving, which is a more abstract way of using motivic techniques, but also a really strong one. Let's try a funny scale that doesn't really fit the chord, but almost does. The Augmented Scale is a 6-note scale, which you can see as constructed either of 3 major triads, so G major, B major and E flat major, or it's the sum of 2 augmented triads a half step apart. Here I'm using B and B flat, but you can of course also call it F sharp and G since they're symmetrical. Since the chord is a G7, then some of the notes in the scale work pretty well, mostly the G major triad, and others are pretty far out, which is pretty much everything else. As you will hear, I'm really focusing on using the major triads as a way of creating the melodies. And this creates melodies where sometimes it's inside and sometimes it's outside of the G7 sound. But it still works because the triads are strong enough melodies to carry it. The transition is a bit more abrupt here with a rest before starting the augmented lick, but that sort of creates a shock effect. And then you can hear how I'm using the G major triad to smoothly go back home. The trick to getting outside playing to work is to make sure that what you play as outside phrases still makes sense. It still has to be a melody. And the 2 strategies that I'm using for this have been either thinking another chord so that you can use that chord to create melodies with arpeggios and licks that you already know, even though you still of course need to get used to how weird it sounds on top of the chord in the music. And sometimes you can use a chord that can naturally resolve back into the music like a dominant, but you don't have to, and sometimes I don't. I really think this is something that you have to experiment with yourself to figure out what you like. Just make sure that what you're playing is something that you really think sounds like melodies. Otherwise, it falls completely apart. You can also think in melodic structures. This is a bit more abstract and you probably need to develop this a bit in your playing, but it's about relying on structures like triads and then putting those together. You can work on this by sitting down and making melodies with the triads to get that sound into your ears. And luckily that skill is useful for a lot more than augmented scale stuff on a G7, as you'll see already in the next example, which also has a bit of chordal harmony. Sometimes you want to resolve the melody as if it's a chord, so you want to resolve several notes in one phrase down to other notes in the next phrase. This is a subtle but actually a really great way to make a different, very strong resolution, and it's a little bit like going back and cleaning up the mess that you left unresolved. You can use D7 diminished, or what I usually refer to as F sharp diminished, as a great tension over G7, and it lets you play sort of a dominant sound that resolves back into the G7. But here I'm actually more focused on using triads and chordal arpeggios. Let's first look at the scale. If you write it from D, then it would be these notes. And the first structure that I'm using is a chordal arpeggio from C, so C, F sharp and B, which you could also see as the upper part of a D7 13 chord. This scale also contains 4 major triads, a minor third apart: D major, F major, A flat major, and B major. This example also suddenly jumps out of the harmony using the chordal arpeggio, and then following that up with a wide range melody using a B major and an A flat major triad, landing on that high A flat, which of course is very dissonant over the G7. The resolution is in this case just first running down the scale, resolving to D, the fifth of G7, and then back up to A as a resolution to that long sustained A flat, which is of course is kind of using voice leading, but it's a very strong way to also resolve that long A flat that was just there. The point of playing altered is usually that you want to create some tension that you can resolve by moving to a 1 chord. So in this case, G7 to C major 7. But here, that chord doesn't come. It doesn't go anywhere, but you can still change things up and create a lot of nice tension using the altered scale. The outside line starts with a G7 sharp 5 arpeggio, which begins by sounding like it's just chord tones, but then the E flat makes it clear that really something else is going on. The arpeggio also contains the augmented triad G, B and E flat, which really helps getting that outside sound across. From here, the line continues up to an A flat minor lick that is shifted up as a sequence to A minor and then to B diminished, which helps it get back to the chord as a resolution. As you can tell from a lot of the examples, then triads are an amazingly powerful tool and a great way to create really strong melodies, both abstract and more natural sounding. And if you want to build that aspect of your playing, then check out this video, which covers some of the ways that you can make triads a flexible part of your vocabulary and get the most out of them.